So we begin now with with lecture number 36, a special number, Lamed Vav, and we are in the middle of chapter 51 in part 1 of the Moreh Nevuchim. In the Pines, that's page 113. We're up to the chapter the paragraph which starts now by denying. I'm just going to do a quick reminder of what he said in the first paragraph. And I'm going to warn all of you that for the next several chapters, it's going to be a lot of philosophy about the nature of God. So you're just going to have to hang in there. He's going to build an image to help us get closer to the concept of God is one. We'll get closer and closer, but we'll never quite understand it. Interestingly, several chapters from now, he's going to answer the question, if no one understands it, then how could one person be really intelligent and have more knowledge of God than someone else? Even the least educated, dumbest person in the world has the same knowledge as the smartest guy in the world, because they both know that they don't know. Well, that's an interesting question, which he's going to deal with too. So that, but I'm getting way ahead of myself. So let's begin. I just want to remind us that in the last paragraph, Rambam mentioned a few concepts. He said there are some concepts that are just clear and manifest, in his words, are primary intelligibles, things that we just know that they're just true. And the only reason why sometimes we have to prove those concepts is because over time, people have tried to, or people, whether intentionally or unintentionally, confused them. But then he said, and he ended the paragraph with something that's really important. And that is that any descriptive term that's used of God can really be one of two categories. Something he called an attribute, something called an accident. Those were the English terms that are being used by the Pines. In the Hebrew, Kapachi translates them as a toar or toarim, which is the Hebrew word meaning description of something, and a mikra. Mikra, instead of an accident, mikra would translate better to be a chance thing. So you can describe, for example, a person as sitting or standing, right? You can describe a person as speaking or quiet. Those would be mikra. Those are chance things. No one would argue that you can describe the essence of a person, well, by saying that he's standing, that it's a chance. It's something, it's separate from the essence of the being of whatever it is you're trying to describe. You can say there's a person. The person is a certain essence, and then the person has a mikra, a chance that and what's going to be called in English here an accident, that he's standing. But the essence of what makes a person, that's something else. Now, an attribute, right, is described in the terminology that we're using now. And it's important to keep this in mind because it's the only way to understand the rest of what he's saying. And according to this terminology, an attribute is a description of the essence of something, right? If you describe, and according to Rambam, the essence of what makes a human being human is that he's a rational, thinking, living being. That's how he describes it. Now, you can argue on whether or not that truly is the essence of a human being, but that's what Rambam is calling it. So now that we understand that, let's go and start reading the second. Oh, and Rambam had said, and let me remind you again that we did this last week, but he had said that when you describe God, whether it's by using a mikra or a toar, whether it's an accident or an attribute, you're describing either one of two things. Either you're saying a word which is describing his essence, right? In which case you're really being repetitive and saying the same thing over, right? In other words, it's possible if somehow you had a word that described his essence, you can do that. But then that word isn't really accomplishing that much because you're just reiterating the same thing. Or you can have a mikra. You can say that whatever it is that you're saying isn't describing God's essence. It's just something else that might be describing a way that God's being experienced or something that he does or something that he makes happen. But that's just a description that's separate from his essence. So that doesn't describe his essence. And that's where we lead into the next paragraph. Now, by denying the assertion that terms denoting accidents are attributes of the creator, in other words, by saying that a mikra cannot be an actual explanation of God's essence, one does not deny the notion of accident. One is not saying that it's impossible for there to be a mikra in relation to God, because remember, by its very definition, mikra or accident means something separate from the essence. Once you say that it's something else, well, maybe that's possible, right? For every notion super added to an essence, right? Anything else that's on top of the essence of the thing is an adjunct and does not perfect its essence. That is the meaning of the term mikra. That's the difference between mikra and toar. I'm going to try to interchangeably use accident and attribute and mikra and toar but I like the Hebrew words much better in this case, but just to make sure that we understand what we're talking about. So this should be considered and I'm going to read the sentence, then I'm going to explain it. In addition to the circumstances that there would be many eternal things if there were many attributes, you should also remember as we read through this, and this is a big concept packed into one sentence, and that is that if you assume that there were many different attributes, Rambam is basically saying, right, that it's obvious that it's impossible that God has many attributes. Why? Because if attributes make up essence and attributes each describe different things, then of necessity, if you're referring to those things about God, then you would be saying that all those things are eternal. So for example, if you say the 13 midos, the 13 attributes of God, God is, let's just say he's merciful and he's patient, right? So he each one would have to be describing a different thing which has lasted forever, which is against basic Judaism, right? You can't have more than one thing that's forever. The only one thing is God, not mercifulness, not kindness, not patience. All of those things couldn't be all eternal. Only God is eternal, right? So therefore, it's impossible, again, that you can have, so you have to keep those things in mind, that it's possible to have a mikra when referring to God. It's possible to have an accident, but it's impossible to have an attribute. And once you say it's possible to have an attribute, that can't be. You can't say that, because if there's an attribute and another attribute, you've just created more than one God, and that doesn't work either. So for there is no oneness at all. It is impossible for something to be considered absolute oneness, except in believing that there is one simple essence in which there is no complexity or multiplication of notions, but one notion only, and that is the notion of God, right? So that from whatever angle you regard it, from whatever point of view you consider it, you will find that it is one, not divided in any way and by any cause into two notions. And you will not find therein any multiplicity, either in the thing as it is outside of the mind or as it is in the mind. In other words, as you comprehend it when you look to comprehend, or the way you see it inside your mind when you think about it, as shall be demonstrated in this treatise. So that's what he's laying down. Is that concept clear? Does anyone want to ask or say anything about that concept?
I'd like to ask a question.
Please go ahead.
When he wrote this, was a Trinity around?
Yes.
Or at least the notion.
Last week, Rambam directly quote, he blasted the Trinity, the idea of the Trinity as being the opposite of this.
Okay, because it sounds like this is the opposite of the Trinity. Like it's almost an argument against the Trinity. Yeah,
and he directly said that. He said, "Don't like the Christians who talk about 3 and 1 and 1 and 3." He directly this is like, it's a direct attack.
Okay, all right.
And stated he didn't hold back any words. He said it straight up. All right. So that, but we did that last week. I'm sorry, I forgot to mute everyone, but please feel free to talk if you want to. I just don't want background noise. So in discussing this subject, some people engage in, so then the Rambam says, you'll also hear a lot of thinkers say things that don't that sound like really good words, but when you really think about them, they don't make any sense, right? So some people engage in speculation. What he's really dealing with is the fact that we in Judaism, we know that we always talk about the midos, which are the attributes of God. And he's driving towards explaining to us how it could be that we can explain God by explaining attributes, say he's good, he's merciful, he's kind, if it's impossible for God to have attributes. But let's hold that off because it's going to take weeks till we get to the full explanation. But for now, he's making it very clear that we can't assign God attributes. So he says some people try to answer this problem as follows: that really they say his attributes are neither his essence nor a thing external to us. They're neither. They're something else, right? So they can't be his essence, like I just described to you, because we can't describe God's essence, right? But it's also not something else. It's not something external. Sounds good, right? But, and Rambam's going to tell us in a second, it just doesn't make any sense. Like if you think, the more you think about it, the more confused you get, right? Similar to what others say in other philosophical things, where people use terms that sound great, but when you think about them, they just don't work. For example, when someone says the modes by which they mean the universals, in other words, the things that I referred to before as obvious things that we all know to be fact, right? They say that it's neither exist. Well, they don't really exist, but they also don't exist, right? Or they're not non-existent, they're not existent. There's something else. Well, I mean, that sounds good, but it doesn't make logical sense. Rambam says you have to be able, you can't just say the words, you have to be able to draw logical conclusions, right? Again, similar to what others say that the atom, the atom, see, this is a whole debate in Greek times, and we referred to it last week, of whether matter can be broken down into tiny particles called atoms. And nowadays we know that to be true, but Aristotle felt that was not true and disproved the idea of an atom. And part of the problems, they had all kinds of philosophical debates, is where is the atom? Is it in a place? Is it not in a place? So the people argue and say, well, it's not in a place, but it occupies a locality. So it's basically semantic. It's a semantic mental gymnastics, which when you think it all the way through, doesn't make logical sense. And that there's no act of a man. And then there's the big question of whether a person has true control over his or her choices and what they choose to do in life, right? Does a person have freedom of choice? So the question is, but that contradicts the idea of God's knowledge. It contradicts all kinds of, so you can play philosophical games with this. So some people try to answer it by saying, well, you don't really have a choice regarding the action, but there may be an acquisition of an act by him. In other words, whether the action that happens that I did, whether I own that action or not. If it doesn't make sense to you, that's the point. Rambam is trying to say that such semantics don't really mean anything. So these are things that are merely said, and accordingly they subsist only in words, not in the mind. You can say them and they sound good, but in your brain, when you logically think them through, they make no sense. They have no existence outside the mind. But as you know, I just turned the page to page 114. And as everyone knows who does not deceive himself, if you're not trying to trick yourself, then you would know these assertions are defended by means of many words and falsifying parables. They'll try to tell stories and give all kinds of fancy lectures, right? And prove correct by shouting defamatory polemics. Rambam is saying, and then they scream louder. You know how it is when somebody proves you wrong, you prove yourself right by screaming even louder, right? We see that unfortunately way too often. And various complicated kinds of dialectic arguments and sophistries. Should, however, the man who proclaimed these things and attempts to establish them in the ways indicated reflect upon his belief, if he actually sat down and thought seriously about what he's saying, he would find nothing but confusion and incapacity. These kinds of ideas don't get you anywhere. So, but this is a bold statement if you think about it, because Rambam is going to be telling us a lot of deep philosophical things that we're going to have to go through a lot of mental exercises and logic, and we have been so far already. And Rambam is promising us that his logic is going to make sense, right? I'm not just throwing words at you. What I, meaning Rambam, is saying is going to make sense to you, and hopefully has been until this point, as opposed to the others who just scream louder and say things that sound good but make no sense. But again, still talking about this other guy, for he wants to make exist something that does not exist, or to create a mean between two contraries that have no mean. This is the idea that, you can have something where you can have a mean, like, something can be like this, or this along a continuum. And then you can say, well, if you take 100 people, they all fall out like around this continuum in such a way that the average is somewhere in the middle, right? That's a mean. But sometimes it's either is or isn't. It's either black or white. It's either yes or no, right? So you can't create a mean if it's one or the other, right? Or is there a mean between that which exists and does not exist? Either it's true or it's not true. Either it exists or it does not exist. Or in the case of two things, is there a mean between one of them being identical with the other or being something else? No, it's either something else or it's the same thing. So what forces him to this is, as we have said, the wish to preserve. And why would people make up such mental gymnastics? Why would they go through this exercise? Because remember, and it goes back to the primary issue that he's getting at, is the fact that people conceive of God in some corporealistic way, while in actuality, there's no way we can conceive of him at all, right? So therefore, what happens is the person wants to preserve the conceptions of the imagination. He wants to feel God is merciful, right? He wants to feel that God is merciful. So if I pray to him, he's going to do something good. If I do this, he's going to do something good to me. He wants to see him as a person who responds in a certain way. If you beg, you get an answer, right? Or if that he has these certain attributes. So that's the way we want to feel. So on the fact that all existent bodies are always represented to itself a certain essences, and everything else we have in life, we imagine as in an essence. The table in front of me, I imagine it as a table. My house, I imagine as a house. My car, I imagine. Everything else, we have something tangible. So we want a tangible image of God. On the other hand, right now, every such essence is of necessity endowed with attributes. In the same way that thing has certain attributes. The table is hard. It has 4 legs. It has a tabletop. Right. The car, it has a gas pedal. It has a brake pedal. It has a steering wheel. It goes right. There are certain things that are of that essence of that object or that thing. So for we do not ever find an essence of a body that while existing is divested of everything without attribute. We don't know from our own experience any such thing. So we want to give that to God. If we believe that God exists, right, we want to give him some sort of an essence. So this imagination being pursued, because we're trying to develop this, it was thought that he may be exalted is similarly composed of various notions, namely his essence and the notions that are superadded to his essence. So therefore, several groups of people pursued the likening of God to other beings and believed him to be a body endowed with attributes. That's why they came up with that image. Another group said, no, they raised themselves above this consequence and denied his being a body, but they said, but he still has attributes, right? He still is kind, he still is merciful. But wait a minute, all this was rendered necessary, but that's still not good enough, right? All this was rendered necessary by their keeping to the external sense of the revealed books, because they didn't want to go behind what the verses say in the open. If the verses says something about God being merciful, they wanted to keep it at that surface level without going deeper than that, as I shall make clear in the later chapter that deal with these notions. So remember, so I just want to make it clear. Rambam said we cannot give attributes to God, period, right? We want to, right? And it's a step above those people that give a human type image to God, but it's still not enough. We have to get attributes away. Now, again, I know that this is, it's hard to fathom because we always think of God, and so we talk about God being good. We talk about God being merciful, kind, etc. So we want to give him attributes, but
they don't keep our liturgy.
Yeah, there's tons of places where we have that. So how do we do that? But that's the exercise that we're undergoing. But right now, let's try to knock into our heads what Rambam is trying to knock into our heads, and then we'll see how. So what then are the attributes? Why then is he described that way? And we will get there, I promise. And we're not holding back. So let me stop for a minute for a break before we start 52. Any questions or comments? If there are none, we'll keep rolling. All right. So here we go. So we're talking about attributes. So chapter 52. An attribute predicated of anything, of which thing it is accordingly said that it is such and such. So when we do give something an attribute, what does that mean? And Rambam famously always, and medieval philosophers in general, like to break things down into categories. There's 4 different categories, there's 6 different categories of X, Y, Z, whatever. Right now, there's different types of attributes. The Rambam is going to break this down because he wants to show how that no matter how you look at an attribute, no matter what type of attribute it is, it can't be attributed to God. Now, some of them are going to be very obvious. And as he goes through these categories, later on it's going to be less obvious, but he's going to again emphasize why even those have to be true. So it has to be one of the following 5. We're not going to get through all 5 tonight. I hope to get through 1, 2, and 3. And 3 is pretty long, so we'll see. But what are attributes? So the first group is characterized by the thing having its definition predicated of it. So as when it is predicated of man, that he is a rational living being. So what does that mean? Well, I'm going to look at the Hebrew here for a second. That it's an attribute that describes that it has to, it's a quality that the essence of the thing has to have, right? Now remember, so in other words, a human being, right? Rambam defines a human being as a rational living being, right? That's the essence of a person. The essence of a person is that he has rationality and that he's a living creature. So which is another way of saying he has a soul and a body, right? And a person, by definition, is a fusion of those things. And a soul, not just an animal soul, which is not sentient. Now, I know that there's different levels of animal souls too, but just for the sake of argument, let's differentiate, especially in medieval philosophy, between a human and an animal soul. That a human being is capable of rational thought, and it's fused with the body, right? It's a living being. So this attribute which indicates the essence and true reality of a thing is, as we have already made clear, that type of attribute, which we said before, is really the explanation of a term and nothing else. That's describing the essence, right? So it's describing the essence of a table as being made of wood, a top and four legs. That's the essence of the table. The essence of a human being is rational living being. This kind of attribute should be denied to God according to everybody. And we said this, we just described this. You can't explain God that way, for he may be exalted, has no causes anterior to him that are the cause of his existence, and by which in consequence he is defined, right? We can say that there is no descriptive word that can describe God's essence, because if you're going to come up with a descriptive word, then you by necessity have to have some sort of quality that existed before him, which is incomprehensible, can't be. For this reason, it is well known among all people engaged in speculation who understand what they say, that God cannot be defined. We can't define him, so we don't have a word that describes God's essence. That's number 1. The second group is characterized by the thing having part of its definition predicated of it, right? So in other words, when you say, as when it is predicated of man that he is a living being or a rational being. So Rambam uses the example of a person, he defines it as a living rational being. So you say, well, part of what a man has is his livingness, right? Meaning he has a body with a heart that pumps, it's alive, right? Part of the human being is that he's capable of rational thought. So you're describing part of that being. So this attribute signifies an inseparable connection. For our saying every man is rational signifies that reason must be found in every being in humanity is found. So if you find a human being, that human being must have that rational characteristic. That's his attribute. This kind of attribute also should be denied to God according to everyone. Because if you can describe part of God in a certain way, that God has part of God is that he is fill in the blank, right? Well, then what about the other part? Then you just divided God into parts, and it doesn't work. That can't work, right? His essence must be a composite. It was once you do that, this word describes part of God, that means that God is made up of different parts, which is against the idea of unity, right? The absurdity of divine attributes belonging to this group is like the absurdity recognized with regard to the first group. So the first and second group, we clearly cannot call God by any of those attributes. That's obvious. Remember, obviously, he's going to lead up to more groups that some people might think you can apply to God, but he's going to show us that we can't. So now that we got these two out of the way, let's look at the third group. The third group is going to be a little bit less obvious, but here goes. So the third group consists of attributes predicated of a thing that go beyond its true reality and its essence. These are attributes that are not really describing the actual essence of the thing. so that the attribute in question is not a thing through which the essence is perfected and constituted. So this descriptive word doesn't describe the essence. So if you take a human being, right, and you describe him in a certain way, and he's going to give examples in a minute, right? It's over and above or different from the fact that he's a rational living being. He's a rational living being who is, fill in the blank with what we're about to in a second. Consequently, that attribute is a certain quality with respect to the thing of which it is predicated. There's a certain quality that it has. Now, what does it mean, a quality? It's considered one of the supreme genre. That's an Aristotelian term, right? Which is regarded as one of the accidents. We're coming up to the level of mikra. Remember, there was toar, which was a description of the essence of God or whatever it is that you're describing. And then there's, which we said can't apply to God. And then there's mikra, which is a chance, a descriptive thing which could change. For example, thus, if an where am I up to? As regard to what? Thus, if an attribute belonging to this group would subsist in him, if you would describe this in a way, if you would say that one of these types of attributes, one of these types of accidents, then God would be a substratum of accidents. This is sufficient to show how far from his true reality and essence this is. So I mean the supposition that he is endowed with qualities. So if you suppose that God has certain qualities, right, then it is, however, strange that those who proclaim the existence of attributes deny, with reference to him may be exalted, the possibility of likening him to something else or of qualifying him. For what is the meaning of their saying that he may not be qualified unless it be that he is not endowed with quality, right? So what the Rambam is saying here is that if we're going to say that we can describe God in certain ways and give qualities to him, in other words, he has an essence, but that essence has certain qualities. And you can see where this is a very fuzzy line, right? Once you start saying that he has certain qualities, then the line between essence and qualities is very fuzzy. And all of a sudden, God has this quality sometimes, and this quality sometimes, and this quality sometimes. And it'll make even more sense as he describes what does it mean to describe him with a quality in the next paragraph. So I'm in the last paragraph of 115. There are 4 genre of qualities. I will accordingly give you examples in the way of attributes of every one of these genre in order. And the reason why is because he knows that the paragraph he just told us was a little confusing, but it will get clearer as he describes specific examples. So he's going to give 4 groups of examples in order that you should know that the impossibility of the subsistence of attributes of this kind in God may be made clear to you. So you'll understand why you can't describe him this way. Because right now I'm thinking, okay, God has an essence, which I can't understand and I can't describe and I can't give attributes to. But he has qualities. So he could be kind, he could be merciful. What's wrong with that? Why doesn't that work? So let's hit that, let's get into that. So the first example of what does it mean of a quality that a person could have, or God, or anything you're trying to describe. So let's use a human being as an example. You predicate of a man one of his speculative or moral habits, or one of the dispositions subsisting in him, qua an animate being. So for example, when you say someone is a carpenter, right? In other words, he has a skill. He knows how to work with wood in this case. Or chaste, which means he's kind of person who stays away from things that he shouldn't be involved in. Or ill, you say that he's ill, right? So you just gave him a quality, right? There is no difference between you're saying a carpenter or you're saying a learned man or a sage. You can also say he's an intelligent person, he's a wise person. All of these being dispositions that are subsisting in the soul. There is also no difference between you're saying a chaste man or you're saying a merciful man. For all arts, sciences, and settled moral characters are dispositions subsisting in the soul. All of this is clear to whoever has occupied himself, even to the slightest extent, with the art of logic, right? So in other words, if you think about it, you can describe a person in many different ways. None of those are the essence of the person, but those are qualities that the person could have. He may have this type of quality, he may have that type of quality. The second example would be as follows. You predicate of a thing, a natural faculty that is in it, or an absence of a natural faculty. So you say, in other words, this is more a physical, it's soft or hard. Is the person muscular, or is he soft, right? And there is no difference between you're saying soft and hard, you're saying strong and weak. Is he a strong person or a weak person? All these being natural dispositions. So that's another way. You're not describing his essence what makes him a human being, but you're describing some quality that this particular human being contains. The first example was more of a spiritual thing, and the second example is more of a physical thing. The third example is as follows. The predicate of a man, and kapach in the Hebrew explains that this is different from the first one in the sense that this is referring to how a person reacts to others, whereas the first example was referring to how a person is just in general, what kind of a person he or she is. So you predicate of a man a passive quality or an affection, as when you say affection, meaning how that person can be affected by other things, as when someone is irascible, irritable, timid, or merciful. So he's the kind of person that reacts to other people in that way, or reacts to other situations in that way, in cases in which this character is not firmly established. Or you're predicating a color, a taste, a smell, warmth, coldness, dryness, humidity of a certain thing also belongs to this kind. The fourth example is as follows. If you predicate of a thing like something that measures an amount, something which pertains in its respective quantities, you say it's long, short, crooked, straight, or other similar things. So these are different ways you can describe a person or anything that you're trying to describe by using any one of these four different categories of descriptions of qualities. Now let's get to the main point, what he's trying to drive to. So when you consider all these attributes and other things similar to them, obviously I didn't list, Rambam says, all the possible attributes, but you will find that it is impossible to ascribe them to God. I can't say that God has one of these things. Why? I can't say he's long or short, right? For he does not possess quantity, so that there might pertain to him a quality pertaining to quantity as such, right? There's nothing there for me to say that is soft or that is hard. That there's no quantity to say that is long or that is short. Nor does he receive impressions and affections. Remember, we said we can't talk about the category of things, how he reacts to things, because God cannot by definition react to things, because that would mean that he's being changed by things that are outside of him, and he can't be changed by things that are outside of him, right? So that there might pertain to him a quality belonging to the affections. Nor does he have dispositions, right? Well, if you have a disposition, like I'm just a naturally angry person, or I'm a naturally merciful person, right? So that there may be faculties and similar things pertaining to him, right? Because then you'd have to say it just doesn't work, right? So nor is he maybe exalted and endowed with a soul. So you can't say that he has clemency, modesty, and similar things, or that his mind reacts in a certain way. Because what does it mean when you say someone's merciful? It means the way you react to a certain situation is with mercy, but God doesn't react to situations, and there is no soul there to react to things, right? So, for instance, and we can't say that it's health or illness. It doesn't make sense. It is accordingly clear to you that no attribute that may be brought under the supreme genus of quality can subsist in him, may he be exalted. So we can't use those. I'm going to read the small chapter here, and we'll conclude today with that and open up for discussions. With regard to those three groups, the first three, which are the attributes indicative of the essence, or a part of the essence, or a quality which subsists within the essence. Remember, all those qualities are descriptions of the essence of whatever it is you're describing, but since God doesn't have an essence, you can't, the bottom line of this last category is, those are all describing the essence. And if God has the essence isn't true, we can't describe, so that we can't have a descriptor of it, right? So it has already been made clear that they are impossible with reference to it. So these Rambam is not even going to deal with, because it's impossible. We can't use these things. For all of them are indicative of composition. They must be made of something. And the impossibility of composition with respect to the deity, we shall made clear by demonstration. God cannot be composed of anything. He's not composed of any matter. So those are the first three types of attributes. And then number 4 and 5 we'll study next week, which will be a little bit harder to understand why you can't apply them to God, but he's going to describe this why you can't. Okay, so as we get deeper and deeper into this, it's going to build every week. By the time another 4 or 5 lectures go by, we're all going to be medieval philosophers ourselves. But anyway, let me hold this now and see if anyone has any contributions, questions. You can go open the floor. If there isn't, then I'm just going to say that on my own, that and Rambam said this, we want to ascribe to God attributes that we're familiar with as terrestrial beings, right? We have a desire to do that. So as Rambam starts smashing these notions from our brains, it gets scary, right? Like we want to think of God as a merciful Father in heaven, right? We want to think of God as being kind and patient and all the attributes that's given to him. We want to think he's powerful so he can smash our enemies and accomplish things. We want those things. If we don't have them, it's very unsettling, at least initially. I promise you that when we're finished, it won't be unsettling, right? But it takes a while to get there. But in the beginning, when you go through this process, it's scary breaking notions that have given us comfort for our whole lives. But in the truth, once you realize that that stuff which has given us that kind of comfort was false, was wrong, and then you start to realize that, I need to find comfort in other ways. And it becomes a very different experience. And that's what we're heading towards. So I hope you guys hang out with me as we go through this process. If we don't have any other comments, I'm going to stop here. Are we good? Well, I'm going to skip next week because of Hanukkah. So we're going to take a week off, and then I guess the next time let's see, what day is it now? It's the 14th. So we're looking at, I guess, the 28th will be our next, our next session. Okay. So the next one, the 21st, will be the fourth night of Hanukkah. You can think about Rambam when you light the 4 candles for that night. All right. Everyone,
sounds good.
Have a wonderful Hanukkah and be well, and we'll be in touch. Bye.
Thank you. You too.
Yasher koach, Rabbi.
Right.
Thank you.
Welcome.